Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to the Public Sector on Air Hour here on OpenShift TV. I am Chris Short, producer here of OpenShift TV. I'm joined today by the one and only Justin Nemmers.
Oh boy.
Justin Nemmers used to work at Red Hat on the Ansible team. Now he works at MindPoint Group, and I will let him introduce himself real quick.
Well, Mr. Short, thank you so much. Yeah, what do I do? And what did I do? Always kind of a funny thing to
How did
recollect.
you get here?
Exactly. Well, I woke up in the morning and, like everyone else, put my pants on one leg at a time.
Oh, there you
Yeah,
go.
no. So anyway, I was original employee of Ansible. I started in 2014, and in that process, I've always been just a lover of technology. And the thing that attracted me instantly to Ansible was just the elegance of the solution. So started off selling into the public sector with the team Ansible, and then ultimately, once we were acquired by Red Hat, I ended up leading the business within Red Hat for a handful of years before eventually departing for other things. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that, like, if you look at the history that I had at Red Hat across the board, that was my second stint at Red Hat. The first time I worked on the
Right.
public sector team, I predated even Paul Smith for that matter, and many of those folks,
Yeah.
which was kind of fun. But in a way, like, I guess I just can't escape the Red Hat orbit.
And that's fine, right? Like we like having you in the Red Hat orbit.
I mean, I don't mind being in it. To tell you the truth.
And to be honest with the audience and everything, like Justin Nimmers gave me my job at Red Hat essentially. So if it weren't for him, this wouldn't exist.
Oh boy, you flatter me, man. I placed a high amount of my value on the success I'm able to help other people attain. So
Well,
in
that's
the
what
end,
matters
like, all
most.
I did was string it together. But it was you and your awesome set of skills and talents that ultimately delivered. So
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So you're working at MindPoint Group now, and MindPoint Group does some pretty awesome things in the public sector. And like I want you to give, like, like the elevator pitch or whatever you want to call it of MindPoint Group for sure. But then I want to talk about something, specific to MindPoint Group, which is called Ansible Lockdown. So let's dive in.
yeah, I appreciate it. So, it might be interesting to kind of tell the story about how I was originally introduced to MindPoint Group. So, jumping all the way back to 2014, when again working with Ansible in the public sector, one of the questions that I continued to get were questions around, well, this Ansible thing sounds really great. Could I use it to stig my systems, or could I use it to apply CIS benchmarks to my systems? And the answer was always yes. Of course, it's a great use case for it.
Right. Yeah.
But the logical next question was, okay, great. Well, where's the content? And I was like, well, I mean, you write it yourself. Like, it's only 360 controls for RHEL 7. Like, it's not that bad. Like, have at it. Like, spend a Sunday, over a beer or something.
Oh, even
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
So the end result was that through a couple of connections, I got introduced to this team that was using a bunch of Ansible within a couple of existing contracts. And this ultimately was the MindPoint Group. And in the process of using Ansible for those contracts, it became pretty clear that there was an opportunity kind of for both of us. And so what we ended up doing was partnering with MindPoint Group way back then to start to build out a community around content creation for security baselines. And that admittedly was just a very small niche of what MindPoint fundamentally did, but it ended up being a really important one. And over the next handful of years, we spent a significant amount of time kind of working with MindPoint Group as Red Hat and as Ansible to help kind of continue to build the momentum around this particular community. And then when it came to my departure from Red Hat and eventually joining MindPoint Group, it was kind of a natural place where, yeah, you know what, of course, I finally have the opportunity to hire point people to invest in this line of product. And that's exactly what we did. So, for MindPoint Group as a pure play cybersecurity consulting business, it made a ton of sense simply because no matter what framework you select, no matter what your cybersecurity maturity is, everyone struggles with the application of security baselines. And the reality is, yeah,
Yeah, it's inevitable.
yeah, that's what amazed me from my earliest days at Red Hat, getting hammered by customers that were replacing Solaris with RHEL. trying to figure out like, oh, well, Solaris has all this really nice tooling around Stig, and Windows has all this really nice tooling around Stig. Like, where's Red Hat's? And
Yeah.
the best we could muster was a Kickstart file. This
Right.
guy who now works at MITRE, named Aaron Lippold, and I sat down over a couple of weeks, and we wrote a bunch of really nasty shell scripts that were appended on a Kickstart file. And
Wow. Did that become the Aqueduct project? Because that was a whole nother project that was trying to
yep,
apply Stigs through Bash and
yep. So
everything else. Like it was a nightmare too. Yeah.
we were certainly aware of the Aqueduct project. Never really did any direct effort on it. And then
Sure.
there were other offshoots that came out of Puppet and some others. But the reality is, it still remains just this really kind of big, hairy challenge. And I was amazed all the way back to 2014 that the same problem that I'd spent 6 years trying to solve at one point or another, Red Hat was still like effectively not fully solved. And that's where I saw a massive opportunity for Ansible. And thankfully I had a great partner in MindPoint. But when I joined MindPoint and we looked at kind of the whole spat and broad range of cybersecurity solutions that we offered, lockdown was really one of those things that just fit super well into everything that we were doing. So if you look at some of our biggest customers, and our mission ultimately is to be every customer's like go-to
Right.
resource around all things cybersecurity. And we're quite successful in that realm. It's great. And every single one of these folks ends up needing something like lockdown on some level or another. So it ends up being a really nice fit.
So the problem you always, I feel like, run into when you're introducing something like Ansible or Puppet or Chef or Terraform or insert, infrastructure as code tool of the week, is like the cultural buy-in part, right? Like that's always really hard, and especially for like the public sector or government in general, right? Like, me, I was a veteran of the U.S. Air Force, right? Like change was hard, right? But like RHEL, I could get my hands on and I could do stuff with in the Air Force. Some folks, right? Like the idea of using Ansible to manage systems in their environments is like just a foreign concept, right? Like automatic management of systems. They're doing some of it right now, maybe with like a WSUS kind of replacement, whatever happened after that. But it's not like a fully comprehensive way of, saying lock down the system, keep it locked down.
Yeah, well, I think that like if you step back and kind of look at just technology in general, one of the biggest challenges of adopting a new enterprise technology anywhere in your environment is kind of twofold. So problem number one, in the cultural realm, I should say, problem number one is that there's always like a level of effort or lift. There's like a barrier to entry that you have to overcome. But then the second part of the problem is you got to find the right use cases.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest struggle from there ends up being that any tool, no matter how simple, and like Ansible is very simple, but at the same time, it can also be horrendously complex. It's all in the eye of the author of the playbooks and roles and whatnot. But the challenge ends up being that even if you have something that's really simple to use, when you start to look at how you can apply it in an environment, the more out of the box it just kind of works, and the more use cases that you can bring to the table, the easier it is, I think, to actually adopt it, even if it's just for those use cases. And in fact, it's easy to wear my Ansible hat. As a matter of fact, these are the original Ansible Inc.
Oh yeah, I remember those from your old office. Yeah.
I take it with me. Like, what? Like, my
That's
photo board is
awesome.
but
And it's funny because they put a sign in its place. And I remember the last time I was at the Ansible office last year, I was like, there used to be something else here.
yeah.
And now I found it. I love it. That's great.
Yeah. It's half the time I'm sitting at my desk and you can only see the word accountability and you can't see the other two. So I get a lot of like, what are you trying to be accountable for? And I always have to like pivot the camera up.
Nice.
No, but anyway, I think that like showing up with a use case ends up being a really powerful driver. And when I take my Ansible hat off and I just look at like the culture of technology adoption within the enterprise, so much of it is tied in with how do we use this right? Very rarely are organizations going to be successful just saying like, we're going to get rid of all this other stuff that we're doing and we're only going to be on this new thing. when in reality it's always
Never works that
it's a
way.
grayscale, right? Like you
Yeah.
start here and you go here and you end up with differing levels of all of this stuff. It doesn't matter what that stuff is. It could be Puppet Chef, Terraform, Perl, whatever.
Whatever. Cloud formation, bash scripts,
Sure.
anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so like the more you as an organization can work with a wide ranging set of technologies in a sustainable way, I think the more effective each one of those technologies can ultimately be. And so, certainly from the C-suite and slightly below, you often have this mantra of, oh, well, we have to try to standardize on just this one piece of technology. And while in a lot of cases that might be true, I think it's also a bit short-sighted to always be trying to minimize your IT stack. Like really what you need to do is find better ways to sustain the various tooling that you have in order to get the most value out of them in ways that don't open you up to additional areas of risk. And it's easy to say, right? Clearly hard to implement, hard to do, but
Yeah.
but yeah, that's my take on it at least.
So like I remember my experiences as like a DevOps consultant and then working in, some new places, setting up DevOps shops, right? Where, for years Ansible was like my tool, right? Like in my tool belt to do so many things, right? And I had such great success with it. It's one of those things though where it's like, so I tell this system to do this set of things in this order and everything's going to be okay. How do I trust that? Right. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, this is what unit testing is for. And this is what all the, like, you introduce this like whole chasm and
Yeah.
whole different way of thinking. And sometimes it puts people like it's off putting to some people, but sometimes it like cracks people's heads, right? Like they don't understand how the new world works,
Yeah.
right? Like so they're trying to struggle. So bringing that use case and saying, hey, this might like give you the idea of how to push forward. Where have you seen success with that, right? Like
Yeah. I mean, it's a
where
great,
where 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 does the fork in the road go from there? Kind of thing is basically what I'm asking. Like,
yeah, it's like how deep down the rabbit hole do you really go?
right?
Um,
Yeah,
Well, I think it's like anything, it's a sliding scale of maturity. So the customer, the user that kind of newly adopts Ansible to do a couple of simple things, they're not thinking about testing. They're probably not even thinking about like how do
no,
they ensure that they have like secure code stewardship
yeah,
over their playbooks. But certainly the big enterprises and the big IT organizations within the government are. They're the ones that
right,
are really worried about like, well, how do I make sure that if I'm pulling this set of playbooks or roles from an open source project that they actually do what it is they're supposed to do.
mm-hmm.
So when you start to think about just secure pipeline development and then integrated testing towards unit testing and even beyond that, like you need a bit of functional testing and all of that as well.
Right,
And
yeah.
you need COVID chaos. All the like the booming and crashing in the background.
Oh, you're fine,
Um,
dude.
but you need to start to layer these things in. And the reality is we all know it's it's easy to make bad architectural decisions from an early point in your Ansible development, such that it
Mm-hmm.
makes it very difficult to start to do things like that. And
Yeah.
really, what we've tried to do in both hiring a number of original Ansible employees, some of them that literally wrote the book on Ansible training.
Mm-hmm.
The whole purpose of this was to, in all the automation work we're doing, be able to overlay this idea of a as best as possible set of practices
Right.
that if you look at the patterns that we've implemented and you follow through with those in your own environments, you're going to be in a much better, much more sustainable way. Such that, Ansible in a well-automated environment kind of helps future-proof that environment, but you also need to kind of future-proof your Ansible implementation as
Right.
well. And
Exactly. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
only way you do that is by doing variables properly and segmenting things properly. And we have a lot of good examples of this. I mean, even looking at the Ansible Lockdown and Lockdown Enterprise stuff, the shift from a standalone role to a collection is one that's almost a no-op for us because of how we decided to actually string it all together.
Mm.
And that's that set of expertise that I think makes what we do so interesting and so unique compared to really anything else out there. Candidly, even other things that Red Hat is paying people to work in.
Yeah. Like Lockdown Enterprise, I think, gives folks a supported way to do STIG and CIS compliance with y'all as like kind of the entry point into their automation journey, right? For lack of a better term. And it almost forces, it doesn't quite like that DevOps mantra of right, like do, test, act,
Yeah.
change, that kind of thing. And iterative development and making sure that your things work and like teaching you how to like, oh, there's this exception here. How do we make room for that? Right. Like that is always super tough um to get folks on board with.
Absolutely. It gets
And
even more complex when you roll in like security teams, because the second you start to talk about baseline and scanning and
right,
whatnot,
like
it's
they
not
want to
even
show
doing
up and tell you how
DevSecOps.
to do things. Yeah.
You're not even doing DevSecOps at that point. All you're really trying to do is just prove to them that A, you know what you're doing, and B, like the system meets the compliance requirement.
Right. Like take your existing testing tools and we're going to apply the stigs our way and you can test it and verify it yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I bet 9 times out of 10 like they find more things in compliance than out of, right? Like so.
Well, and yeah, there's a huge reason why this is so difficult. And it really comes down to, in some cases, the capabilities of the scanning tools.
Yeah.
In other cases, the fact that every scanning tool is a little bit different. And often they're even different. The rules are different between OS platforms. Just to give a great example, like I'll pick on Nessus for a moment. Like, hey, great vulnerability assessor.
Awesome tool. Love it. Yeah.
Yeah, great vulnerability scanner. The challenge ends up being that if it's looking at your, let's say, SSL ciphers, it expects them in a very, I mean, it's basically doing a regular expression.
Yeah, it's a regex check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's looking for an exact order.
Yeah.
And if you have
you might have it in the wrong order.
exactly, if you have an extra space in there, if you have like if you have an extra capital in there, even though you're technically
Game
compliant
over.
to the baseline, it's going to throw a finding, and
Mhm.
security is going to be all over your butt to fix it.
Yep.
But that's just one of a number of different examples. And then when you start to flip the script a little bit and say, okay, well, maybe they're not using Nessus, maybe they're using any one of 1,000 other tools, you can understand the challenge that ends up being the remediation market when you're trying to enable a platform and enable a set of tools on your people that actually have to like answer to the security folks. I mean, it's a nightmare. And it's one that admittedly we haven't fully solved. What we've tried to do is build a framework such that it's easy enough to actually go back and show directly that, hey,
Right.
this is actually something that has in fact been remediated.
Yeah, and building that framework, I feel like, is vitally important, right? And making that framework, exist in a way so that the security folks can plug into it as necessary, I feel like is like the next step in getting those teams involved and establishing higher trust between the tooling and the practices and all the changes that are happening in their environment. Because it is kind of drastic for security teams sometimes when you're like, by the way, we're going to hit this one button and it's going to stig your systems and you can go out and run these in prod now, like you're good.
I think what's also kind of fascinating is that the other key challenge was not just like, hey, how do we baseline something at instantiation? Like that in a lot of ways is kind of
like a clean OS is easy to baseline, right? Yeah, that's nothing. Yeah,
you look at it sideways, like it's no longer compliant. So the other challenge that we had was how could we actually use one of the most powerful aspects of Ansible, and that is its ability to be run and rerun over and over again. The one word that every marketer hates is the idempotency.
Yeah.
So
the hardest word in the Ansible language.
Exactly. And I, as a Ansible marketer in my past, also hated it. And yet, so, but like one of the challenges that we had was how could we use that aspect of Ansible's design as a powerful way to enable us to create content that would not just remediate, but it would also validate. So again, anyone can sit down and write a shell script or a Puppet manifest or whatever that will take care of something on day zero. The bigger challenge ends up being that as this system goes through its life cycle and it gets new packages installed or packages removed and it gets new applications installed and all of that.
Users in and out. Yeah.
And the ability to track that remediation and really force remediation and validation in an ongoing capacity is in many ways a bigger problem than even just deploying something that's compliant. So that we put a massive amount of thought into that effort as well, and really there's a long line of people that have contributed to this. David Federline, certainly, or aka DFED, as a lot of people
Oh
know him.
yeah. Yeah.
But David is one of the kind of core architects of this, and he's smart enough that as you look through the lockdown content, we're actually breaking apart the segments that would remediate versus the segments that would validate. So if we have a module that we trust and know is in fact idempotent, then we can do it in one step. But outside of that, everything else has to be done in two steps, especially with, even the best content is still occasionally going to shell out, right?
Yeah.
And you can't trust a shell command unless you wrote it.
Right. Exactly.
But that's where all the testing comes into play, right? So
Yeah.
end result of that is that by kind of separating the validation from the remediation steps, it allows you a really powerful and flexible manner to look at every single system. And even if you have 1,000 different snowflakes, you can develop a pretty simple config file for every single one of those systems that will apply its baseline just the way it needs it.
Right.
And then potentially even extend that, including customizations and into the app stack as necessary.
Yeah, like when I introduce Ansible to new work centers or organizations, however you want to phrase it, the hardest problem I've always found is like how to shape and mold that inventory file, right? Like how do you break up the logical units of compute into things that need to like be managed in certain ways, right? Like this app gets deployed to those servers, sure, but what's the security profile of that server look like? Does it need to be different because of that app? Does that app also have connections in and out that also need to be like accounted for? And right, like, Ansible acquired Molecule like right after I joined, and I'm curious, like, are you doing a lot of validation with Ansible itself, with Molecule, a little bit of both? Like, how's that validation process working for y'all?
Yeah, so we had started off using a bunch of Molecule and admittedly have moved away from it to some other kind of in-house built stuff. And
Okay.
the reason for that was kind of several fold, but one of the biggest ones was that we were having some like longer term viability and stability issues around our testing. And it candidly was just breaking too much. And when you're looking at 370 rules that really comprise thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of a role, that when you run it raw on a really thin machine, because we're cheap and we're not gonna stand up big fast instances,
Yeah.
like a full run could take you 30 minutes. And as a result, like the testing was becoming too expensive and too challenging to do it like that. So we've built some, and David has built with his team some other mechanisms internally that we're using for that. That so far are working really well. There was a bit of GitLab in there. I think there's now a bit of GitHub in there as well. And candidly, I wish I knew off the top of my head the entire tooling stack that we're using.
Oh, there's no way you're gonna know, dude.
Yeah.
So like that goes back to Dr. Richard I. Cook, right? Like, so he has this concept of above the line and below the line, right? And we've hit this point in technology where you have an assumed understanding, right? This is all his thesis, right? You have an assumed understanding of how your system works. Any deeper understanding than that is probably not founded in like logic unless you've actually gone out and done the digging yourself. So like there's that, Ansible, I feel like tries to keep you above the line, right? Like to where you don't have to worry about how the kernel is going to manage something, how the file system should be configured, right? Like you can instantiate that in an Ansible playbook or anything, that you need to configure, put it in Ansible and run it multiple times a day and you're good, right? Like that I've always felt like is a tried and true way to do things. But again, it does create that below the line experience where you're kind of trusting the code that you wrote to always work. So that's why I ask about validation and how you're doing it, because that piece is hard, right? Like, and trying to do it myself with the Ansible stuff I write is like, should I just do an assert here, or should I should I actually shell out to do the validation, right?
So
like
one of the ways that we actually, so we certainly have written specific validations for every single rule. And by the way, we do this on Rel 6, 7, 8, still in draft form, but we actually had a customer the other day pipe in and say that they without any modifications to our content, scored a 97 on a stock Rel 8 system.
Good job.
So yeah, we're happy. We're happy with the performance on that, as are they, as should all of the citizens of this fine this fine country. But the interesting part is that we don't just rely on our own knowledge here. We actually go out to things like Nessus and OpenSCAP and whatnot, and we'll then use those tools to also score our systems. So, if you happen to be a paying customer, then we'll actually go as far to support false positives or really any finding for that matter. If you run into a finding, we'll help you close it for paying customers. For upstream users, and to be clear, there really is very little difference between what I would consider to be, the free upstream versus the supported product. The main difference ends up being in signed binaries, and I say binary. I use the term loosely since it's all uncompiled Ansible. But we do sign the releases for those organizations.
Which, yeah, like, I mean, that makes total sense.
Yeah. And then we also have the ability, whereas you're just getting kind of the raw feed in the upstream, our paid offering has line snapped for actual releases. But any one of those, we are constantly on every commit hammering the resulting systems with a number of different scanning technologies to validate that they're like, hey, this is legitimately correct. And then candidly, in some areas, we're even going a bit further, right? The one example that David loves to use is like, okay, great. You scored a 97 on your Stig scan. That's fantastic. Unfortunately, you're running the Splunk agent as root.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like there's always something, right?
Yeah.
Like there's always something, right? Like you could get a 99, but there's always going to be the one vulnerability that will bite you, right? Like it's that struts2 vuln. It's that you're doing this one process wrong.
Written on the bottom of your keyboard. Things
right. Stuff like that is just like, like it's a security manager's nightmare waiting to happen. And like, you can't prevent people from writing their passwords down on the bottom of their keyboard, which mine is not as well, right?
Oh yeah, this is proof. Not on the bottom of the trackpad either. Just
yeah. No, I can't. I don't even know how I could write on that. Yeah. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that like there is so much that can go wrong in your systems that you can't think of every possible scenario that could go wrong.
Yeah.
And that's where tools like Ansible Lockdown and Enterprise Lockdown or Lockdown Enterprise, come in to kind of help you like prevent you from stabbing your own self in the foot, right? Like from having that false assumption that you have a complete understanding of your system and thinking that you are secure is the number one step. And like everybody thinks they're secure until they get hacked, right? Like it's an inevitability, right?
I passed
like
my Nessus scan, Chris. Like it couldn't have.
I know.
DNS. Oh crap! It was DNS.
It's always DNS. It's funny. Like I have a friend that swears, or a coworker that swears he knows DNS in and out. And I think
demoted from friend to coworker.
Yeah. Well, whatever. Yeah. However that.
Hard time, man.
Yeah. Anyways, there was like a Cloudflare issue in my region with DNS last week, and I was like, the second I added Google as a secondary, everything started magically working. It was DNS, like, like got the crown him champion in that moment. But the amount of things that can go wrong, like even configuring your DNS wrong on a box, right? Like if you use an external resolver as opposed to an internal one, you're going to get different results. And like things like that's not part of a STIG, right? Like that's, you hope it's resolved to the right stuff, but
right. I mean, and I think this is the challenge where you can only automate so much. Like ultimately, you're going to have a set of processes and procedure and policy within the overall organization that aren't necessarily automatable on the micro scale, but perhaps are on the macro scale. And that's when you start to look at like the ATO process, the authority to operate, right? It's a total nightmare to get. But one of the reasons is you actually have to go in and prove in many cases that you've got all of these various policies and procedures in place, and you have to demonstrate like what you're doing to actually make sure that you're following them. And when you start to look at like, so how does this all come together? On one hand, you have the baseline, you have the larger kind of security framework, you have infrastructure vendors like Red Hat, for instance. I think that there's useful capabilities of things like, and I'll pick on OpenShift for a moment. When you have an integrated solution like that that can be configured and bundled in really a best practices manner to make sure that all of those, dare I say, the idiot switches are turned off, right? Like,
Right.
if
Yeah.
you're an expert user, sure, like run it in this mode. But if you're not, then like the stock mode that we send it to you is probably going to be good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's a lot of security tooling that gets baked into OpenShift, but yeah, you could totally shoot yourself in the foot and just turn it off by accident, right? Like
Oh
if you
yeah,
don't know what you're
absolutely.
doing, right? Like, and that's any system, right? Like that, not just OpenShift, that could be default Kubernetes, that could be your Railbox, that could be, your Mac, anything you're using, right? Like you leave the wrong permissions on an iPhone, guess what? Anybody can own it, right? Like it's just the nature of the world we're in.
Yeah.
So folks that are trying to like secure the underlying layers are vitally important right now. Have you found like people coming to you with like open arms in a lot of cases, like save us, help us kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of our larger customers, they started off small. They started off saying, hey,
Mm-hmm.
you know what? Like, we're trying to go for FedRAMP and we need some pen testing done. So great. We dive in and a couple of our pen testers go all crazy
Mm-hmm.
on their app. And the end result is they learn a whole lot. And then
Like a
that,
whole lot more than what they thought they would learn just about
yeah,
that app, I bet too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And full transparency. I mean, MindPoint Group is the team that actually pen tested Tower before we open sourced it as AWX.
Right.
So I think what was interesting about that is we did it really to validate that we weren't about to unleash a whole bunch of 0 days into
Yeah.
the open world when there were thousands of these customers that were already using this thing. That would have been
Right.
very bad.
Yeah. That would have been awful.
Like there weren't any. We had actually built a really secure and stable application, and not to toot our horn at that moment, but I believe the pen testing team at MindPoint was woefully disappointed about how little they actually discovered. Which I'll just call it what it is. Like usually not the case. So
Yeah,
like
that's very
our
odd.
dev team, they
Yeah.
crushed it. They crushed it on that.
Well, good job,
But
Tower team. No
like
kidding.
anyway, so the end all of this conversation is that many times we'll have a customer show up and they just have like a couple little questions and small engagement. But one of the things that we like to say pretty frequently in MindPoint Group is that in one of us, there's all of us. And I apologize, of course.
Oh, you're fine.
Without fail, the landscapers, the neighbors.
Yeah, that's with Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday for me. I forget now.
Nothing like the high gain microphone. Yeah. So what was really kind of cool about this is that because we have such a broad range of cybersecurity talent within our organization, anytime someone's working with a customer engagement and we come across something that like doesn't look quite right, and even if it's not that individual's area of immediate expertise, guess what? There are 150 other experts within our business that individual can pick up the phone and call. And that's one of the things that's just been most amazing through my travels through our business is, and I say travels virtually now. My God, I almost missed airports. Can't believe I'm saying that. But no, it's so often when we're engaging in a with a customer and we are, let's say, doing a pen test or let's say just doing some GRC work or something, we come across other areas where we know that we're going to be able to demonstrate value. And in the end, like, if they select us to do it, great. We would clearly love that. But our main opportunity, our main goal is to continue to gain that customer's trust, that user's trust, and continue to make sure that they are putting their most secure foot forward as possible. So, what we ultimately care about is the security profiles and the security postures of our customers. And the nice thing is that we're well positioned to be able to deliver, nearly any talent, all the way up from CISO level talent, all the way down to like, hey, I'm going to write a bunch of playbooks to ensure that your VMware and Amazon is effectively secure.
All right, so two sensitive questions, I'll just say. One, how many customers have said, hey, we want you to do this, but just not in Ansible? Has there ever been a situation like that?
So, it's funny you mentioned that the first paying customer, Lockdown Enterprise, was a large Puppet customer. And they bought Lockdown Enterprise prior to actually making a purchase from Red Hat, but they ultimately did make a Tower purchase as a result of that. to the best of my knowledge, they're still active Puppet users, and frankly, we're okay with that.
Yeah.
The biggest thing that we get really, because admittedly, most of the effort that we have is self-selecting towards Ansible users. Um, the biggest questions we get are people that want other platforms and other applications. So, Ubuntu, LTS 20 dot something, that's the big.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine how many people you got asking for
Um,
that. Yeah.
yeah, but outside of that, like we had before the even the draft of the Rel 8 Stig was released, we were getting hammered over that one. They're like, why haven't you guys done the Rel 8 Stig yet? And we're like, really? Like, how is this my fault?
Like, you realize the architecture difference between Rail 7 and Rail 8, right?
You realize that the Stig hasn't been written. Like,
It
there
doesn't even
was
exist yet, right?
was
Like,
no.
they're still writing it.
Well, do you know when it's going to be out? No. I mean, secretly, of course, I'm picking up the phone and calling people to figure out what in the world's going on. But
Sure.
yeah, so yeah, we haven't really gotten many, if any, requests for doing it in other languages. We fully anticipate that will probably happen as we continue to expand the platforms. Where I really see that coming into play are for folks that want to do kind of cross-cloud compliance. Like, in the end, Azure has their own tooling and AWS has their own tooling and
Yeah,
has
everybody's
their own
bespoke
tooling.
tooling set.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you truly are multi-cloud and you're not using Kubernetes or containers or something like that, then you've got to be able to ensure that those environments as deployed are compliant to your requirement. And that
Exactly.
probably wouldn't happen with native Ansible. Like we would probably do a bit of either native tooling within those cloud environments in
Mhm.
conjunction with something like Terraform, in conjunction with Ansible in order to
Yeah.
paint a clear picture of what's going on. Uh,
Well, I mean, and in some instances, right? Like, it could be like we use Terraform and Lockdown. It's like lawyers checking lawyers, so
yeah,
you don't break stuff, right?
yeah,
Like, and I see that use case being like almost ubiquitous potentially, right? If you
yeah,
have
yeah. And that's
a playbook, like, or if you have a role that can test that this box is stigged, then apply, just run it and see what
exactly.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah,
And then,
exactly.
so
It's the validation step ends up being like
right.
hugely important as part of that. And we do have the notion to build out some of those cloud capabilities so that you could basically point it at, and maybe it's actually even native Python. I don't know. I mean, that's going to be up to
Yeah.
David, but the goal would be that in one view you could basically say, hey, look, like I'm running n number of rel systems in Azure, and
Hmm.
I know that both the systems themselves as well as the cloud infrastructure that they're deployed in fact, check all the boxes for this particular baseline.
Right. So, second part, and you don't have to answer this question in any way, shape, or form. How has COVID-19 potentially affected the speed of which people are securing systems, or like not necessarily your business, like, but like has it accelerated, decelerated? Like people are all of a sudden trying to play catch up. What do you see is going
What's
on
this
out in the
COVID thing that
market?
you're talking about? It's a new term. I haven't heard it at all.
So it's this thing called COVID-19. I don't know if you haven't traveled recently. That
Okay.
might be the reason why. Uh,
In all seriousness, it's interesting. Like from a cybersecurity perspective, I think it has done a couple of things. Number one, it's accelerated businesses' fears around the things that they know they should have been doing but weren't doing. Especially when you
Interesting.
take a largely on-prem workforce and force them remote,
Mm,
it asks or creates all sorts of questions and all sorts of areas of investment concern.
right.
Like if you've been investing in on-site print infrastructure and on-site Wi-Fi, but not
Right.
like VPN concentrators, like you may have a problem.
Yeah. All of a sudden your budget shifts. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly.
So that's
Yeah.
that's been one huge area where many of our customers have been working with us to help try to figure out like where are they truly weak when you take a fully remote workforce into account.
Right.
The other area certainly has been, I think, in our careers, this COVID probably has been the single biggest driver of digital transformation that I've ever seen. So it
Really.
hasn't been cloud. It has
Right.
companies suddenly realizing, oh crap, like our entire business model has been totally thrown on its head, either in a good way or a bad way,
Right.
purely
Yeah.
because you have like a sudden and massive sea change shift
Mm,
of consumer demand and requirements in a different direction. And
wow.
if you as a business are not able to navigate with significant agility the new landscape, then you are screwed. And so what I've
Yeah.
seen really is an acceleration of organizations across the board that are making more progress on their digital transformation efforts in the past 9 months than they have in basically the history of the business.
The history of their business. Wow, that's just amazing. It's heartwarming to an extent, having been in DevOps for a decade, right? Like that finally, yeah, yeah, finally it's happening. But now that I'm sitting on the OpenShift marketing team, it's like you finally get it.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like, where was this 5 years ago? But no, I did never want this. I never wanted this to be the way that digital transformation got adopted.
Yeah, well, I think that I mean, one of the things that I ask myself pretty frequently is like, hey, am I in the right place and am I doing the right thing just for the team and the business and whatnot? And candidly, one of the things that I loved about Ansible is that so much of our story was not related to the technology; it was really related to the people.
Right.
And if I had to say, like, I'm always going to try to work with and create product and capabilities that fundamentally are focused on making someone's life easier and better.
Yes. That's what technology is for. It's not supposed to make our life harder.
True, but it's amazing when you just look at the bevy of technologies out there, like so few of them even
work
really
together.
talk about it that way. And when they do, it's so, I feel like so rarely even delivers on it. And that's the thing that is just kind of, man, I'm tired. Like I'm really tired of kind of the traditional enterprise shuffle in a way. And I think that like we saw a bit of it with Ansible, and you're seeing it other places now where, especially with COVID, when you have all of these users who now leave their office environments and are thrust at home, like they expect consumer level ease of use.
Right. That's the top thing I've seen, right? Like they expect that like iPhone experience out of everything now.
Yeah. So like the corporate apps that aren't able to deliver that are the ones that are probably in the deepest hot water right now.
Exactly.
But that's another area where if you look at like the IT investments that are happening, like in many cases, it's those internal teams that have been struggling so much. And whether you go SaaS or not SaaS, I mean, all of these cybersecurity questions end up being raised. One of the other big areas of things that we do is third-party risk assessments or third-party vendor assessments.
Okay.
And I'll tell a little interesting story here. Like, so naturally, if you're dealing as a business with a third-party vendor that, let's say, is running your payroll, and that third-party vendor, like, that you're providing a bunch of PII to them, like clearly that opens you up to some level of risk, and it's on you, especially if you have to comply
legally, it's on you,
or whatever. Like it falls on you to understand and ensure that that risk is effectively mitigated.
Right.
But another term that I hadn't actually even really heard of before was this idea of fourth-party assessment. Like, okay, if you have a vendor, like let's say, I won't even use a real name, but like let's say you have payroll provider A, and payroll provider A, as it turns out, in order to do your payroll, they've got 5 or 6 other vendors that they use.
Oh God.
And so suddenly,
so they're just gluing together APIs like I am.
Ask yourself the question. It's like you always know when there's the Amazon regional outage, right?
Oh yeah.
Like half doesn't work. Yeah. So that is what they would call a concentrated risk. So if you have like 2 or 3 different vendors that are all kind of doing similar type important work for you, but they all happen to be deployed in the same Amazon location, like that's what they consider to be a concentrated risk. And that
you would have to get the third party to divulge their business model, essentially.
Not even necessarily the business model. They just have to be able to reliably answer these questions. But when you're
still, that's still a big ask, I feel like, right? Like
it is. But I mean, I'll tell you, like, even on the Ansible side, I must have filled out 100 of those things.
Oh, I'm sure.
For our various customers that were required to do it. But it's that level of introspection that I think is super important, that shows like, okay, well, why stop at fourth party? 5th, 6th, 7th party.
6th, 7th, yeah. Why aren't we testing every data center in the country, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I need a guy to look at this link light. Is it orange or is it green? But it is, it's fascinating about how deep you can really go in all of this, and certainly in no means is it a solved problem, but at the same
Hell
time,
no.
what I've just been blown away by even what I've learned in dealing with the teams and working with the teams over here at MindPoint. And so, oh, great, we do this lockdown thing, and it's cool, and you can download it for free, and a bunch of people are using it, and it's dare I say, everyone's favorite way to apply the security baselines. But even from there, it just continues to snowball.
The rabbit hole gets deeper. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean it keeps me up at night, honestly, because I'm like,
yeah, I went to DevOps Day Chicago last year where Jess
Yeah.
Fraz did a talk about just the BIOS and the BIOS subsystems and all the layers underneath the silicon that you don't see or don't get to interact with, and how vulnerable those layers are. It's like, boom, mind blowing. Like now I know why Core Boot exists. Now I know why all these open source projects exist around the BIOS space. After that talk, it was just like, wow, that is insane. And someone says, say hi to Nemmers from Springer.
What's up, Springer?
So yeah, like I mean, again, it goes back to that below the line. Like, you never thought about biosecurity, right? Like, that's not in your wheelhouse, right? Like, you don't care about that, like, but it's vulnerable, hugely vulnerable, and there's patches for it all the time.
Yeah, I think it's funny, and you can almost make the same corollary with a lot of the programming languages. You have the really low level ones, assembly and whatnot, and as you move up the stack and you get more and more abstracted, like I do think in almost every way it becomes harder and harder and harder to truly build something secure. Because in the end, like without that in-depth understanding of how the registers are flipping and how bits are moving around in that hardware, like you're relegating that security to the compiler and or the interpreter, and
those instruction sets that are running on that processor and everything else along with that.
And it's it is kind of fascinating to think about those levels. And I mean, even I would argue with configuration automation platforms, that's yet another level above.
Right.
And it, like, and every single time you add a level, you potentially introduce additional risk into the scenario. And the question is, like, what are your plans to effectively mitigate that? Certainly using content from known sources is great. Developing and building out a reliable internal testing mechanisms is another powerful way to do it. We've got a number of mechanisms that we're using internally to validate pull requests and whatnot. But it's the thing that we're seeing is a lot of organizations will start with something like Lockdown Enterprise, or again, paid or not, I just use Lockdown Enterprise. Keep the lawyers off my back. So the cool thing about Lockdown Enterprise really is that so it's that use case right out of the gates. People can start using it, but it is in a way the thing that kind of starts to shine the light on the dark corners of their environment of, okay, well, great, we're doing this. Now, how do we, insert next question? And that might be like, how do we actually customize it to our application? How do we make sure that we have a reliably secure code development pipeline for Ansible? How do we make sure that, like, this is truly portable across all these different environments? How do we make sure this is effectively implemented in Tower? How do we make sure that we're handling secrets properly? Like, there's a lot of content out there, but it's really difficult in many cases for customers just to get a straight answer on what really they should be doing. And that's another area where I think we excel, is providing that sounding board of, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, sure, Lockdown Enterprise is great, and it makes your life a lot easier to apply security baselines. But the real value that we offer beyond that is in our ability to actually help you effectively implement it. And not just Lockdown Enterprise, but like, how does it tie into the rest of your automation? How do you plug it into CI/CD? How do you plug it into existing ITSM things?
Right, because you already have something, right? Like, you're not starting from scratch. Exactly. You've already got something, and this has to plug in somehow.
Exactly.
I mean, as far as tools go, though, I mean, Ansible is one of the most pluggable, I feel like.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, that's, of course, like, just looking at the modularity of it, one of the reasons we won.
Right.
Candidly, I mean, I remember back in 2014, we were like, we have 150 modules. We're like unstoppable.
I remember last year it was like 4,000 or something.
Yeah, 3,300, I think, on our last count.
Like, yeah, it's insane.
Yeah. I mean, so it's funny simply because oh, now like then take a step back from that and start to look at operators, right? Like you have
Yeah.
this whole other ecosystem building up around operators, and it's kind of a very similar like, wow, this can get out of hand really, really quickly.
Oh yeah, because if you create a CRD with the wrong permissions,
Exactly.
guess what? You've got a security vulnerability just waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Separate aside, so I mentioned like what other, or you'd ask what other things people are asking us for. So again, not really asking for other technologies other than Ansible. One of the big things that we are getting a lot of requests are for our Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So we actually are in the process of building out a Ansibleized Kubernetes STIG and CIS benchmark.
Okay.
So that'll
I
be
bet
pretty.
that is a
That'll be
handful.
pretty badass if I say myself.
Yeah, I will happily run that against my local box here.
If you
Yeah,
apply
down it
all,
goes, and off I go to restore back up.
yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. Never apply all in production. Never,
No,
ever,
ever. Yeah.
ever.
No, that's yeah. Oof. I mean, just in case people don't understand why you wouldn't apply all in production, would you like to explain that to them?
Oh yeah, sure. It's the fastest and best way to brick your system.
Yeah, if you want to take everything down, go ahead and supply
Exactly.
every security instantiation you can think of.
Yeah, it's and that's one of the biggest challenges of baselines, of course, is that they do have to be very nuanced, right? You'll never get to 100. If you do, probably the machine's turned off.
Encased in concrete under the
Yeah,
ocean.
exactly.
Yeah.
In a reef surrounded by sharks.
Yes.
Angry sharks.
Angry sharks. I haven't been fed ever.
Yeah. So of course, the challenge is that like, the STIGs and CIS benchmarks are written to be very generic. They'll say you need to use a software firewall. You need to block all ports that aren't in use. The kicker is, of course, the profile has no idea what ports are actually in use.
Right.
So
maybe you do need TFTP on that box.
Exactly.
Right. Like, even though it's one of those things they tell you to turn off.
And so thus enters the whole waiver process and all of that. But the greater challenge is that, especially in a production system, you can never just run a stock benchmark or stock baseline, because inevitably you will break your application.
Yeah. Unless you've built it against that baseline. Yeah. You will break your stuff.
Yeah. Even if you did that. Right. And that's one of the interesting use cases of lockdown, though, is to use it to not just like build out your production systems, but use that same definition, that same input file, input config file against the content in order to build out your dev instance as well. And so the biggest benefit there from just a DevOps perspective is now you actually are kind of like comparing apples to apples, so that that if something doesn't work in dev, like, well, it's also not going to work in prod.
Yeah,
whereas normally the opposite happens, right?
Right.
But then the second bit of that, I think, is that the same could be argued when you move to containers. Right. Like if you're doing all of your
works on my machine. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, oh, work in my container. Well, as it turns out, you're using different container image, doofus.
Yeah. You're using different container image or allowing too many syscalls. It could be anything, right? Like any number of vulnerabilities enter the container realm.
So, one of the things, we did a couple of things in the content to make life easier for developers and operators. And one of them was that we identified what we called, from our vast plethora of experience, we call it disrupt high. So 60-70% of a baseline is usually pretty innocuous, but there are a certain percentage of those rules that will absolutely blow your world up.
Yeah.
And so we label those as disrupt high. And so typically the process that we would recommend is you start by running it in everything enabled except for disrupt high.
Right.
And that will usually not break your system. Usually. Then from there, you could go in and individually review and apply the other rules until you get to the point where you have something that worked and that is as secure as you can make it.
Yeah, when I needed this, when the Aqueduct project was around.
Yeah. Sorry.
Back on.
Sorry, not sorry. But then let's see, where was I going with that? The
high, medium, low kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So then the other thing that we've done is we've actually made the content container aware. And so when you go to build a container image, like there are certain rules that you still need to apply as the part of the configuration of that container. Yeah. And so we've made room for that in the content so that you can actually tell it like, hey, I'm running on bare metal, I'm running on a VM. So like if I'm bare metal, like I don't need to do well, I need to do pretty much everything. If I'm VM, there are certain aspects, like in many cases, bootloaders and whatnot, that you don't have to worry
Right. Yeah.
about. Certainly, if you're on Amazon, it's not like you're installing Grub.
No.
Or
Well, hopefully you're not installing Grub in your container. I mean,
hopefully, but hey, stranger things have happened.
yeah.
But then on the container side as well, like if you set container native, that's not the exact flag name, but you get where I'm going. If you set that flag, it'll actually skip all the rules that aren't going to be applicable to a container either. And that'll be things like file system bits, like you're not going to care about how your file system is partitioned, for instance. You might in a VM, but you sure as hell don't in a
No,
container.
you don't give a squat about that. I mean, your container, no.
But that's just a lot of the logic that we built in there. But like in all seriousness, the more people that are using this and pounding on it, I think the better off we all are.
Yeah. So I'm just going to link to the open source project and your enterprise.
Yeah, and they can get to it from the website, lockdownenterprise.com. They can
Yeah, there we go. That's what
downloads and all that.
Lockdown Enterprise.
Nice and straightforward. That's my crack at web designing. So
oh Lord,
if you like it, I did it. If you didn't, then I paid someone to do it, and I want my money back.
Fair enough. Justin, it's been great having you on the show today. Really appreciate you coming on.
And it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure, my friend. Chris Short, Mr.
Thank
DevOps.
you. Thank you very much.
I got to admit, man, the fireplace video on the MacBook behind you is an excellent use of the Apple ecosystem. Like,
yes, that MacBook is actually like the iCloud Photos backup MacBook, right? Like it's in charge of storing all the photos of life. So yeah, I figured I'd give it another purpose.
It's brilliant. excellent use of multiple thousands of dollars of technology.
Well, it's really old. Does that count? I mean, I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see.
But yes, that's the perfect way to use your Macs, fireplaces, and behind the scenes work. So yeah, thank you very much, Justin, for joining us. Check us out tomorrow on the channel. I'll actually be out part of the morning, getting an MRI on my neck. It's gonna be awesome. Yeah, not fun. But yeah, so Dev Nation will be kicking off the morning. And then my coworker Eric Jacobs will take over the developer experience office hours, and I hope to be back by the OpenShift Commons time, but we'll see. So, the molasses of life is the world we live in right now. So stay tuned, and when in doubt, go to Lockdown Enterprise to secure your hardware and software needs. Thank you very much, Justin. We'll catch you later, buddy.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.